Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here as a Franciscan and a Franciscan sister of the Eucharist. So thank you. And as Sister mentioned, the theme of our panel is entrusted. And that's such a beautiful word because entrusted means to put something in someone's care or under their protection, or like to put it in your hands. And so my particular offering on the panel is entrusted with creation, which is, I think, a call that I've known ever since I was a child. And God has taken it far beyond what I ever thought it could be. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit on how creation has been put into our care and under our protection, how it's in our hands. And then I'll speak as a Franciscan, and I think also as a woman, that is there a special role for us within creation being entrusted to us as a woman. Now let me see if I can get this to work. Okay, so before I begin, I wanted to let you all know about something you might be interested in. This is a project with which I've been entrusted for the past 5 years, and I'm kind of glad it's done, since I'm taking on this new life. But it's a documentary series on creation that is 6 half-hour segments, and it looks at basically 6 principles that we worked with. I worked with Salt and Light Television, the Catholic TV station in Toronto, to develop the series, and we hope it can be of use, say like for parish groups or for women's groups or university groups, maybe for like a 6-week study session for each half-hour segment to look at the issues of why we should care for creation. So there's 6 principles, and you can get to it on that website, and you can actually watch it on that website, and there's a study guide as well. So I wanted to, and that it also could be helpful for seminaries and for religious communities if you're interested in the question. Okay, so I think you all have a handout, and I know, being a teacher, I know now I'm going to hear all the rustling of papers when you get the handout out. So, and I just wanted you to have that. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but it's basically 3 points from Laudato Si that I feel are important. It's a long document, the Encyclical of the Pope on creation and on the care of our common home. And I just thought you might want to reflect on some of these as I'm talking. Now, the idea, the subtitle is on care for our common home, and Cardinal Turkson, the president for the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, was closely involved in the preparation of the encyclical, and he has highlighted that they deliberately use the word care in the subtitle rather than stewardship. And the reason for that, he says that stewardship implies a relationship based on duty, but care taps into something deeper. So he says when one cares for something, it is something one does with passion and love. We cannot love God when we do not appreciate or care for what God has made. This is what the Pope wants people to understand. Whatever you want to call the Pope's message, it is essentially an invitation to make our love for God show in what God has made. And so I think that's a beautiful way to look at it, and that idea of care is kind of like entrustment. So entrusted with creation is even more than stewardship. It's put in our hands, and we are to care for it with passion and love, because it's been entrusted to us from God. Okay, so the first point, I must admit, when the encyclical first came out, I literally stayed up all night to read it. And it might have been a little pride on my part, but I was very nervous because I knew I was going to be interviewed the next day. And it's a long document, but the one thing, in the middle of the night, it was probably about 2:30 a.m., I came to this paragraph 66 in chapter 2 on the gospel of creation, and I just found it so stunning. And I would say that there is what we would call a theological development in this paragraph. I haven't heard too many people saying this, so I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I've been teaching it to my students, so I'll teach it to you too. But so when we say a theological development, it's not something totally new, but it's something in continuity with the tradition, but also a new light shining on it in a way that's never been shown on it before. And what I think is important here is what is in bold on your handout for paragraph 66. The Pope saying, human life is grounded in 3 fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. Now, we've always heard with God and our neighbor. We love God and we love our neighbor. But what I think is quite fundamental here is that he adds, and with the earth itself. And this isn't the only place in the document. It's constantly referred to throughout the encyclical. So I think that is something for all of us to pay attention to. One of the implications would be, of course, is when we examine our consciences, we examine them in light of our relationship with God, our relationship with our neighbor, and our relationship with creation, how we have treated created matter. So I think that's an important point that's at the heart of the encyclical. Now, and the Pope then goes on to say in that same paragraph, when any of those fundamental relationships get broken, we have sin. So this is going right back to Genesis. And one of the ways in which, in the contemporary world, we struggle with our relationship with creation is this whole idea of, environmentalism. How do we care for creation? And so what does it mean to have dominion? And here I would like to introduce a little Franciscan theology from a beloved Franciscan theologian, St. Bonaventure, who's been very dear to my heart and the heart of our community. And Bonaventure has this idea of the human person as a mediator in the center between the earth and God. And that we are in upright posture, right? And we know that from science too. And when we're in upright posture, we can look up to God, we can look down, and we can look to the sides. But when we sin, we become bent over. And so when you bend over, what do you see? You mostly see the ground, right? And so Bonaventure says, well, when we get bent over due to sin, we really can't see God. And so we tend to think that the only reality is what we see, which is this earth, right? And we can get caught in that. But so as mediators, I think this is a way to think of our dominion in a very positive sense. We have to assume our proper place in the center between the earth and God. And so creation is entrusted to us in that central position, not to dominate it or to manipulate it, but to get it back to God. And in fact, for Bonaventure, the journey of the soul to God begins actually with creation. And so we first sense God when we experience him in and through his creatures. And that, for St. Bonaventure, is the start of the spiritual process. And that awe and wonder, which is the title of the first segment of creation, when we experience that leads us to think, well, who created this? And that kind of draws us on in our pursuit of God. Okay, so that's point number one. Now, point number two is this whole idea, though, of the intrinsic goodness of nature. So we are in the center as mediators, but we say there's an instrumental good and an intrinsic good in creation. The instrumental good is the usefulness, and we have to have a useful creation, right? We have to eat. We need all the things we have around us. So we have to use creation. But the Pope in the Encyclical, and I think it's important to note, he does also emphasize the intrinsic good of creation. So again, going back to Genesis, God said that it was good, right? And it's good in its very being, not just for its usefulness. So when we say the intrinsic good, that's why I have this paragraph 69 on your handout that the Catechism clearly and forcefully criticizes a distorted anthropocentrism, so a distorted sense of who we are as humans, saying that each creature possesses its own particular goodness and perfection. Each of the various creatures, willed in its own being, reflects in its own way a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness. And I'm not a Dominican, but since there are so many Dominicans here, I also have to mention St. Thomas Aquinas, a good friend of St. Bonaventure, who said that the variety in creation reflects the incredible omnipotence and variety of God, that every different piece of creation is reflecting some different aspect of God. And so God is so much far beyond anything we could imagine. So I think because creation is good, then we have to recognize that intrinsic good of creation and really respect that. And with an attentive listening, like a contemplative listening like Elijah had in today's reading, listening for the small voice of God and the tiny, gentle breeze. And I think it's a good reminder for us in today's society when we're running around all the time, how attentive are we to listening to creation? I've just been thrilled moving to Michigan. I've been there 1 week now. but I've already seen a bluebird and sandhill crane, and just to hear all of that. I love living in the city too, but I think that attentive listening is really important and helps you appreciate the beauty. And then the third point, this idea that there is no ecology without an adequate anthropology. So again, going back to the first point about our relationship with God, with neighbor, and with creation, and yet the second point, the intrinsic good in creation, we always have to put ourselves in the proper relationship to this world, right? And the Pope talks in chapter 3 of the Encyclical about the roots of the crisis. So he wants us to reconcile. And he mentions two roots. One he calls technocracy, or the Technocratic Paradigm. Kind of complicated word, but just for our whole technologized society, run by cell phones and electronics. And then he mentions on the other side this misguided anthropocentrism, where we're not sure who we really are in creation. And it's really important that we know who we are, because we are a key creature in creation. And the Pope says we have a schizophrenia between two extremes, between this technocracy, which is like where we become very dominant humanly, we're controlling everything, we're into consumerism, we always need to buy the latest iPhone. I'm happy to report I sat next to a young college student on the plane, and he told me he didn't upgrade to the latest iPhone. He decided in the idea of simplicity to stick with the iPhone 5, I think it was. Whatever. Okay, but we have that technocratic paradigm, which is always pushing at us. And on the other side, we can have a sort of distorted sense of biocentrism where we almost divinize nature. And I've had a lot of experience in the environmental field with secular persons, and unfortunately that it does tend to go that direction. We say there's no special value for humans. I mean, we share 99.5% of our DNA with the apes. We're not really different. And that tends to lead to a loss of the sense of the dignity of human life. So there's many implications of that problem. So we have this set of the technocratic paradigm, this biocentrism that are unbalanced, and they're fighting at each other, and they lead to a kind of a schizophrenia inside of us. And here's where, and we can actually lose a sense of reality, says the Pope, when we get caught in that schizophrenia. So we no longer know who is really the human person, what is really male and female, what is the family, what is creation, and so it can lead to ruptures in those three fundamental relationships. So we really have to maintain, I think, a true sense of who we are as humans and of our place in creation as, not as dominators, but I love that image of mediators or gardeners who are caring for what has been entrusted to us and sharing it with others. So all of our social teachings then flow out of that concept. And eventually we want to give it all back to God, right? So that's our final responsibility. So no ecology without an adequate anthropology. So always remember who you are as a human person. Now, and then who you are as a woman. And when the title came as Entrusted, I don't know if this was why you gave that title, but it made me think of St. John Paul II in Mulieris Dignitatem, his document on the dignity of women. He uses that word entrust. And he says, and this is in paragraph 30, that God entrusted the human being to the woman in a special way. Now, of course, he entrusted every human being to every other human being, but to the woman in a very special way, precisely by reason of her femininity, and this in a particular way determines her vocation. And so I'm just throwing out some ideas here. This is just some thoughts that I've had that I want to develop more, and I'd love any of your questions. But what is the specific role of the woman in the entrustment of creation? So, for example, St. John Paul II, he speaks about part of our feminine genius is empathy, interpersonal relations, receptivity, communication, personalizing things, and our maternity, both physically and spiritually. And that God, in the entrusting of the human being to the woman in a particular way, we are entrusted with creation in a particular way, I would say, because, I mean, that's the mission. The human person, the woman is the one that brings the life into the world in complement with the man. but it's the woman who gestates the life and brings it forth. So I think we're responsible for creation in a particular way, and that's part of our vocation as women. And then the idea that we, and this comes from Pope St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, that we have a strong influence in humanizing culture, that the culture relies on us to help to humanize it, to personalize it. And so when you think of that paradigm of dominance in the technocratic paradigm, how much as a woman, as women, Catholic women, can we help to, I guess, to soften that hard face of the technocratic paradigm and to personalize it and not to lose each individual person and their worth in this mass kind of drive for consumerism and for power and for technology. So I think, and in a way, I think that love for life and that respect for that dignity of the individual human life is something that the woman, of course, the man needs to have it as well, but that the woman can bring to the table in a way of humanizing our culture, which is tending to become very dominating and technocratic. And then I love this quote from Pope Benedict XVI, that women are bearers of love, teachers of mercy, and artisans of peace. And the Pope says, this is in a homily in 2009, he says, we urgently need women as bearers of love, teachers of mercy, and artisans of peace, bringing warmth and humanity to a world that all too often judges the value of a person by the cold criteria of usefulness and profit. And so, for example, if you think of the industrialization of agriculture, for example, or technology, I think that's where the feminine genius could really be brought to bear on some of these questions to counter those utilitarian attitudes and just bring back like the warmth and the connectedness and the sense of relationship, say, associated with caring for the land, with growing food, with caring for animals and breeding animals, and with eating healthy food. So, and again, these thoughts aren't well developed, but it's a theme I'd like to work more on, and I'd love your input as to, do we have a special role in recognizing the value of creation and of human persons in their intrinsic goodness, in their being, and not just in their being useful? And so I think I would end with that, and maybe just with one comment. This is St. Francis in here in one of Giotto's, famous frescoes in Assisi, and the Pope refers to St. Francis as really the exemplar of this kind of integral ecology that he's talking about, as someone who healed the rupture in the relationships between God, humans, and creation. So I'll end on behalf of all the Franciscans with that. Thank you.